Let us take a look here at volumetric lighting. It used to be the case in Lightwave that volumetric lighting was a property of the light itself. That is no longer true. We have instead an entirely new method of doing volumetrics, which is via having an actual volumetric object, if you will, in the scene which is rendered. Let's see some of the basic settings for this. First of all, we do have an option in lights, which is the effect volumetrics setting that we see here. With this setting off, a given light will not affect any volumetric objects, but of course with it on, it shall do. And you'll see as well that each light has its own volumetric samples setting here. This of course is similar to the regular sample settings that we see for shadows, but pertains only to how many samples the light takes for volumetric. We also see, if we come over to the render properties, we have a couple of different options. First of all, we have enable volumetrics on the volumetrics tab. This will enable or disable all volumetric rendering for the scene. We also have this setting, indirect sampling, which causes volumetrics to be lit by global illumination here. It's basically the same thing as the effect volumetrics for the light setting, but with respect to the GI. Again, that has its own sample setting for how many indirect samples you want the volumetric to use. Be aware, this is pretty slow. It does give you the option to have lovely global illumination volumetric lighting, but it is not the quickest. We have use legacy volumetrics. If we look over on the effects panel, we'll see that there's a legacy volumetrics tab here, which basically gives us access to the old-fashioned hypervoxels that we've been used to from earlier versions of Lightwave. We're not really going to be exploring those in this training. We do be aware that it is either or. You are either using the new volumetrics or you are using old hypervoxel volumetrics. Of course, old hypervoxel volumetrics, the hypervoxels will still be affected by a given light, but what you don't have is the option to use old style volumetric lights. We then of course have fog, and we'll look at that in detail in a separate video. Notice also in the GI tab we have this affected by volumetrics option here. This determines whether or not the GI light is absorbed by volumetrics, and we'll see about that afterwards, or at least we'll see about the absorption. So, how to add a volumetric item to our scene. As I say, it's basically a volumetric object. In other applications or renderers, you'll see this as a participating medium. So what we want to do is add a null. We'll bring up its properties here, and we're looking at what type of primitive it is. It is going to be a hypervoxel volume. And we can see here in OpenGL, we have this volume object has appeared. You can set the source item for it. Of course, that will normally just be your thing that you've added it to. We can have a couple of different shapes here for the volumetric, whether it's a sphere or a cube or even a cone. I must confess, I'm not as certain how often a cone will come in useful. I suppose you could always attach the null here, or parent it rather, to a light, in which case then you'd have a cone volumetric coming off that one light. But generally, for the most part, either a sphere or cube is going to be our most useful. We can set the size of this object, how big it is, and then below that we have this step size setting. This is basically just the quality setting for the volumetric. A smaller step size value will render more slowly but be more detailed, and a larger step size value will render much faster but contain less detail. You can think of it as how often is there a slice, if you will, in the volume. Of course, viewport preview turns that little preview on and off, and then we've got the settings for the actual volumetric itself, which we'll look at in detail in a moment. So first of all, let's just throw on the VPR so we can see what a volume object looks like, and indeed, there it is. You can see quite plainly that if I toggle the effect volumetrics on and off for this light, that we have the effect of it there. Of course, this is a distant light, so it's very flat shading in our volume, which at the minute kind of looks like a bit like a cube with subsurface scattering on it. In all honesty, that's not such a bad comparison, because of course a volume in the air does sort of behave a bit like that from lighting purposes. In the same way that a subscattering surface object has light penetrate into the object and then bounce around and scatter forwards or scatter backwards. It's just that the object is somewhat nebulous. It's a bunch of little particles of dust or smoke or vapour or something of that nature. And so, just like such surfaces, you'll see that of course our volumetric here has a couple of settings. It has scattering and it has absorption. As light goes into the volume, then when that light hits a particle of something, it will be scattered off it, or the light may be absorbed. And that is what our settings are. This will all be a little clearer if we see it not with a distant light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on OpenGL overlay here. And let's just turn my light into a point light. And here we go. Now we can start to see how the light is affecting our volume, especially of course if we put our light inside the volume here. There you can see that the light is of course inside this volume and light is spreading out and of course bouncing off that volume, or bouncing off the little particles inside the volume, or whatever, however you wish to think about it. So let's have a look at what's actually going on, because this volume is doing two things. One, it's scattering the light and it's also absorbing light. The absorption is largely what is responsible for the fact that it is getting darker the further away from the light a given section of the volume is. You'll see that if we take the absorption scale down to 0, so now it has no absorption whatsoever, then you can see that our light of the volume is of course much brighter. The light of course is still falling off because of course we have intensity fall off for the light itself. If we look at the scattering, we'll see that if we take that down, well, if we take it down to 0, then the volume no longer scatters light at all. It's as if the volume just did not exist. The light is now able to pass through this volume completely unhindered. It's neither scattered nor absorbed nor anything. As such, usually most volumes will want to have some measure of both in there. Of course, we have a scattering colour, so that allows you to dictate the colour of the medium itself. So if we make that, say, pink, then what we get, seemingly paradoxically, is a green volumetric rather than a pink one. Why is this? Well, it's because it's the pink light that is being scattered, and so the light that comes through that we see is of course the inverse of that colour. So of course you see up here on the colour wheel we have pink. It is the opposite colour that we wind up seeing as the scattering. Of course you can see that the same is true for absorption. In this case pink light is being absorbed, and so only green light is therefore making it out of the volume. So that is what we see when we have a colour in absorption. We have this setting at the bottom here, asymmetry. You'll remember of course back when we were talking in the foundation section about all of the basics of rendering, that we have this difference between backwards scattering and forward scattering. That is what the asymmetry controls. This will be more obvious if we set to something like a spotlight. So now you see we have this little cone of light coming out from our spot there. If we look at it here from the side, then we can see we've got this certain effect. If we turn the asymmetry up, let's try it at 0.5, then we see that it appears to have gotten darker, or rather its fall off appears to have gotten less. If we set it to -0.5, then we see that it's getting further. Negative values in the asymmetry give us a volumetric that produces more forward scattering, and positive values in the asymmetry give us a volumetric that gives us more backward scattering. And of course with an asymmetry of 0 we are getting a scattering that's even in both forward and backward directions. Now when it comes to volumetric shadowing, we can see if I stick a simple ball in here, just have a little sphere object, then we can quite plainly see, we shall as soon as this resolves up a little bit more, that we get these nice shadows being cast in our volume like this. There we are, much more obvious from this sort of an angle of view, I think. We can see of course our light behind the item there, and of course our sphere and the shadow into the volume that is being cast by this sphere. So you see, this volumetric item, this cube or sphere or whatnot, really is like a volume object. It is kind of like having a model, an actual 3D model of a mist. Lights and objects can go inside it or outside of it, and light will scatter through it, and if objects are inside of it, they will cast shadows through it, and so on. Now, of course, by default, you know, this is just sort of an homogeneous sort of mist. It's just the same everywhere, the same sort of density. If we want to fiddle around with that, we've always got the nodes here. And as you can see, this gives us inputs to the primitive that lets us control all of these parameters, such as the emission, the scattering, the absorption, and of course the texture of the volume itself, where the volume is or is not present. So if we grab something like, let's just say a multifractal, shall we? And we'll plug that straight into texture. Then initially we don't seem to get it very much, but what we need to do is use a texture mode here. So we have non-pyroclastic and pyroclastic. Pyroclastic sort of gives you this exploding looking thing, and this is really when you want to try and use the hypervoxels to do explosion types effects rather than volumetric lighting effects. So for volumetric lighting we generally want non-pyroclastic, and as you can see, this gives us our texture in the actual volume itself. Effectively, it's a bit like putting a transparency map, if you will, on to the volume, where the mist is, where the mist isn't. And that really allows you to create these sort of dust cloud effects and the like. Of course, you can change the density of your texture. You put it down to nothing, and what a surprise, you get no volume because there is no density to the volume. And the amplitude simply sets how strong the texture is. So you'll see, of course, if I set the amplitude to 0, then it's the same as having no texture plugged in there at all. Of course, you could be tweaking that by, you know, changing something like the opacity of the texture here. I mean, that would have exactly the same effect as changing the presence of the texture, or the texture amplitude, I should say. Multiple ways of doing the same thing. So that's all well and good, but this probably gives a slightly better display of exactly, you know, what is going on with these whole volumetric lighting options. What we have here is the old sponsor model there, and you can see that I've got a null, which is there selected, and of course I've got a cube volumetric attached to it, and that of course you can see. Let's just switch to shade, shall we, so that we can see it. There of course is our volume, right? And that's scaled up to be 10 meters, and I've also scaled the null just to stretch it out, which of course you can do with these volumetric items. Is you can just, you know, scale and change them in that sort of a way. But of course what this means is that we have this volume completely enveloping the sponsor itself. And so we've got some lighting in here. So if we just switch ourselves to a camera view and we just, of course, go to VPR, then we see this is just the basic lighting. I've got GI off here, just a skylight coming from a portal up there, and also a distant light, which is giving me my sunbeams here. Of course, if we pop open to the render properties and I turn on the volumetrics now, then, well, it all goes dark because, of course, my volumetric is doing a lot of scattering. So you can start to see the light eking through up in the top corner there. But the light is being so heavily scattered that it's not now reaching the floor. So let's bring that down to, let's try 0.1, shall we? And there we start to see the effect of our volumetric, including, of course, here where we have the sunlight coming through, as that just resolves up for us. Then there we are, and we start to see, of course, the regular sort of appearance that we're expecting with volumetric light. We have these God rays, or at least as they would be called if they were coming from behind cloud. We have these ray beams of light coming through the volume into our space there. Let's just give our camera a little nudge down the hallway here, as it'll make it just that little more obvious to see. We'll go back to VPR. And there we go. The sunlight is streaming in between the columns, and as we can see, we are getting our volumetric effect there, and these beams of light coming through the dust or mist or whatever happens to be within this atmosphere. But because it is an object, right? We have this big cube, which is a volume through and through, then of course we are getting this full scene volumetric. So it's not just the case that we have to set up, volumetric lights in each of these positions to give all of these separate, bands of rays where the light is coming through between each of these columns. We're also, of course, getting the volume from the sky overall. And I can possibly just take that down even more there. There we go, down to 0.02. And of course you see the effect of that, because it's now scattering less. We're still getting this volume, but of course we're seeing through it more, because of course the light isn't being scattered. Again, before I said that you can sort of analogize this volumetric object to a subsurface scattering object, right? And you remember way back in the foundations section, we sort of analogized a subsurface scattering surface as being somewhat similar to a transparent or translucent surface. What an increase in the scattering does is to, of course, just scatter the light, and that, blurs out detail, as it were. It effectively makes the volumetric thicker or heavier in this sense. And so you see here that with our reduced scattering scale, we can see more detail further into the distance. Of course, if we wanted, we could add some absorption here, which would begin to absorb light, and you can see that as a result the scattering is no different, but the scene becomes darker because of course the volumetric is now absorbing light power. So this is now rendered, it's still just as clear, we can see it just as clearly, that area of arches across the courtyard there, but it is lit more dimly because of course the light coming from our portal up above, by the time it reaches this point it has been dimmed because some of that light energy has been absorbed. As a result, usually when you are using these volumes to do volumetric lighting effects, very often you will want your absorption to be very low, or of course you want the colour of light that gets absorbed to be very dark. Again, you've got this balanced equivalence here. Yep. So a high level absorption of a dark colour is basically the same as a low level of absorption with a bright colour. Yep. By setting this grey here to 999, that would be the same, exactly the same level of absorption. If we just take a quick look at it here, let's just let it resolve a little. Okay, that's what this level of absorption looks like. Let's just do a little switcheroo, and there you see, with my little switch, I've got basically the same effect. The render looks the same. Why this value? Well, of course, that was 9, wasn't it? 9 for red, green and blue, and of course 0.0352 is 9/256ths of 1. So there you have it. Basically it's exactly the same. Having absorption 1 and this at RGB 9 is the same as having that at RGB white and this at 9/256ths. Again, it's that equivalence that we talked about way back in the original diffuse video. This behaves a little different if we do the same in scattering. So of course, we turn our scattering up to 1 and we set the scattering colour to be dark. But of course, notice what we get. We're still getting the same level of light penetration. If I just turn this back up to white again, then of course you'll see how incredibly dark it was, right? Let's bring that back down again to something very, very dim like this, okay? So we're still getting light penetration, yep, as in it's not being absorbed, but it's not scattering as heavily. But you'll see that we still have, there we go, as it starts to come about there, you can see that it still gives us this very dense, thick, foggy, misty, dusty, whatever appearance because we do still have a high scattering value. So again, even though there's an equivalence between the colour of the scattering that you use and the scattering scale, you can actually tweak that effect to allow yourself to have deeper light penetration so that you're not getting a dark scene with volumetric lighting, but still get this very thick pea soup type of an effect in your volumetric. Now, of course, we said that we can use volumetrics with global illumination, and we certainly can. So let's just turn this on. I'm just going to use brute force for the heck of it here. So there we go, is brute force GI. It's going to be noisy. Okay, so that's lighting up our interior space here with global illumination. But let's actually take a look at volumetrics, and we'll turn on here indirect sampling. I'm just going to speed this up by giving myself a bigger step size there so my volumes render a bit quicker. So we'll turn on indirect sampling. I'm going to set the indirect samples low just for speed and ease here. I set them to 4. And the easiest way to see this is to again use the buffer view. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pick the volumetric indirect. And the interesting place to see this will be down here at the floor position where of course the sunlight was coming through and hitting that floor. And so we see once it's had time to, work itself up, then this is what we get. And you can see of course that the bounced light coming off the floor here, and as well as any bounced light that's coming off the walls or the ceiling or whatever else, lights up the volume. As I already said, this is most noticeable in this area here on the floor where that distant light or the sunlight was falling and lighting up the floor quite brightly. And so what we see is that we've got this sort of mist or dust or whatever near that position being lit up quite brightly. Now this is great and lovely, and you can get some wonderful volumetric effects like this. In short, you can get full scene volumetric global illumination. That itself is a pretty high-end rendering effect. The downside to it, of course, is that it's fairly slow. As we can see, it is pretty noisy, and of course to get it better we would have to increase the samples quite a lot, the volumetric GI samples that is. Now you might wonder if it would be faster if we were using interpolated GI, and the answer to that I'm afraid is no. Whilst of course you can be using interpolated GI to, light the actual interior itself, to light the geometry, the indirect sampling of the volumetric will only sample as brute force. That means that you can be rendering your scene using either brute force or interpolated, whichever you're wanting to use, but the volumetric sampling will be done as a brute force process. That does make it slow and expensive to render. Of course, if that's what you are absolutely needing and wanting, this, volumetric global illumination, then, you've just got to choke it down, so to speak. However, you will find that there are other little things that we can do. Specifically, the cheat that we can use is the one thing that you might have noticed we haven't mentioned yet, and that's the emission. So let's turn that off. Let's switch over to the volumetric emission buffer, which for the minute will be black. And what you'll see is that you've got an emission color and again an emission scale. Emission is just luminosity. It's the volumetric emitting its own light. Now, because this doesn't need to be traced, it doesn't need to be sampled from any light, it's really nice and quick. So let's just give it some color, anything will do. Let's go with blue for now, and we turn the emission scale up to 1, and well, there you go. You can see that our volumetric is now emitting light in the scene, and there it is, very bright. Of course, you would normally have this down much lower, so let's take it down to 0.1, and there you can see we have that. It's very similar to fog that we will see, as I said in the other video, but of course what you can do with this that you can't do with the fog is to use the textures. So of course, if you're wanting to texture your volumetric to get a smoky look to it, not only can you have it lit by the lights, you can also have it doing a kind of emission like this. And although it is a cheat, it's obviously, not correct in the global illumination sense. As you can see, it's not brighter near the floor where the sunlight was falling. It does, I find, make a pretty good stand-in rather than waiting a near age for true volumetric global illumination to render. Certainly if you're doing a still image, then you can probably, get away with using the, actual volumetric GI. Your render time will be a bit higher, but it's probably going to be quite usable even at high resolutions. However, once you get into animation, unless you've really got a lot of rendering power behind you, then you will find that more difficult, and this emission volumetric makes a lot more sense. So if we just pop back briefly to our main render here, and again I've still got the GI actually turned on, just doing the old brute force swiftly there. GI for the geometry, that is, not the volumetric. And of course you can set up your scattering and your absorption as you like, and you can turn on a bit of emission in your volumetric as well, so you get both the lighting effects of the volumetric, and of course you still are able to see volume in areas not touched by regular lighting, so somewhat faking GI. And you'll probably find, here I've got it set to blue, you'd probably often find that you'd set that over to whatever colour you might have happened to have. So in this case, perhaps some very pale sort of yellow like that, perhaps a little paler still. And there we go. As that cleans up, you can see that we're getting ourselves a nice volumetric effect from our lighting there. And that really is it. That is volumetric lighting and how it works. And of course, in a real sense, it's not volumetric lighting. Rather, it's just that we have a volumetric object which can, like any object, be lit. And then, as you can see here, once we finally mix all of this together, we get really nice abilities to do full scene volumetrics that give us, sometimes really quite striking or really quite subtle looks, and the whole thing knits together wonderfully, giving us much more control over, fogging and volume and mist and dust in our scenes and renders.